They aimed 128 rifles at him. Not trained soldiers, 128 terrified German women forced to defend a hopeless position, ordered to die before surrendering. Any other American soldier would have fired. Any other man would have called for artillery. But this 21-year-old farm boy did something so unthinkable, so against every instinct of war, that the women froze, then slowly lowered their weapons, then began running toward him instead of away. Hours later, every single one of them would say the same shocking sentence: "If the world allowed it, we would all marry you." What did he do? And why did 128 enemies fall in love with the man they feared most? War creates enemies, but sometimes, just sometimes, it also exposes a truth deeper than uniforms, flags, or orders. This story begins in the final, collapsing days of World War II, when a young American farm boy walked into a battlefield, expecting death, and instead walked out with 128 lives saved, a global headline, and his sentence whispered by every woman he spared: "We would all marry you." But this isn't a love story. It's a story about a rule every soldier is taught to follow: orders, no matter the cost. And the one moment when breaking that rule didn't just change the outcome of a battle, it changed the future of 128 families, generations over generations. You're about to hear the true account of an impossible surrender, of women who had been abandoned by their commanders, brainwashed to believe Americans would torture them, and prepared to die rather than yield, and of one quiet soldier who refused to accept that violence was the only way forward. By the end of this story, you'll understand why the world called him the soldier who stopped a war without firing a bullet. And if this story moves you even a little, then share it, because some moments in history deserve to be remembered, no matter how many years pass. The war was supposed to be ending, but for 128 German women, it was only just beginning. They had been nurses, radio operators, clerks, and medics, women who had joined the military to heal, not to fight. Yet as Berlin crumbled and the front lines collapsed, the officers who once promised to protect them made a final, brutal choice. The women would be sent to the front as a human shield. They were told they would support the last defense, but the truth was simpler and far more horrifying. If they lived, they'd buy time. If they died, they'd buy even more. The transport truck jolted over broken roads as the women clutched each other for balance. None had ever fired a weapon. None wanted to. Some whispered prayers. Others stared blankly at the ruins passing by. But all of them shared one thought: this can't be real. They had heard rumors: Soviet forces taking revenge, officers abandoning their posts, entire divisions disappearing into the night. Now they were the ones thrown into the jaws of a war that had already given its verdict. Their commanding officer barked orders with a coldness that revealed everything. These women were disposable pieces in a game that was already lost. When they reached the small valley village that would become their final battlefield, terror replaced disbelief. Sandbags were stacked, machine guns positioned, and trenches dug hastily into the earth. The village looked peaceful: stone cottages, quiet fields, but the women knew peace wouldn't last long. "You are to hold this line," the officer growled, "and you are not to be taken alive." His words lingered in the air like poison. Some women cried openly, others clutched rosaries. A few tried to steady trembling hands. None of them understood how to fight, but they understood death, and they understood they had just been ordered to accept it. Meanwhile, miles away, a young American soldier from Kansas named Elias Ward marched with his unit toward the same valley. He wasn't a hero, at least not in the way war writes heroes. He was a farm boy who could repair a tractor blindfolded and could tell the time by the color of the sky. He wasn't fearless, he feared every step, but he was steady. He followed orders. He stayed alive. And most of all, he still believed that war should have an end. That belief was getting harder to hold. Every village they passed through was shattered. Surrendering soldiers came in waves. Nothing made sense anymore. As Elias's unit approached the outskirts of the valley, something felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. A village on the map that should have been abandoned was lined with defensive positions. His sergeant raised binoculars, expecting seasoned German troops. Instead, his brow furrowed. This can't be right," he muttered. Elias borrowed the binoculars, and what he saw didn't fit any logic of war. The figures behind the sandbags, holding machine guns awkwardly, were visibly shaking. Some struggled to load ammunition. Others couldn't even shoulder their rifles properly. These weren't trained soldiers. These were women, exhausted, terrified, barely able to stand. Orders came crackling over the radio: "Advance and clear the position." The sergeant nodded, Standard procedure. But Elias felt his stomach twist. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. The spread of fire was uneven and panicked. The timing was off. The voices he heard shouting weren't harsh commanders, they were frightened girls barely older than him. He spoke without thinking. Sir, if we attack head-on, they'll all die, and they don't even know how to fight. The sergeant stared at him, weary from months of losing friends. But Elias pressed. Let me flank around. Let me see what's actually happening. Permission was reluctantly granted. Elias and 2 others circled north, weaving through farmland until they reached a ridge overlooking the German line. From there, the truth was undeniable. The women weren't defending, they were desperately trying to follow orders they didn't understand. Some held guns backward. Some were crying. One stared blankly into the sky, as if waiting for fate to make the decision for her. Elias lowered his rifle. This isn't a battle, he whispered. This is a slaughter waiting to happen. He knew the rules. He knew the orders. But he also knew what his father used to say when a situation looked impossible on the farm. Think with your heart first. Your hands will follow. Elias took a breath and made a choice that defied training, instinct, and the entire weight of war. He stepped out from cover, stood tall, and raised both hands high in the air. His rifle hung on his shoulder, untouched. His helmet gleamed in the late afternoon sun. He walked slowly, deliberately straight toward 128 rifles pointed at him. Shouts erupted from his squad. 2 men cursed. One grabbed for him, but he had already committed. Each step felt heavier than the last. Dust rose around his boots as he crossed the field. And then, for the first time, the German women saw him. Their screams carried panic. Some fumbled to aim. Others retreated behind sandbags. A few shouted warnings in broken voices. Elias kept walking. With each step, he repeated the only German phrase his grandmother had drilled into him. Ich will you helfen. I want to help you. The women froze. No American soldier had ever approached like this. No enemy had ever willingly made himself vulnerable. Confusion spread. Trembling hands lowered an inch, then another, until the guns wavered uncertainly in the air. And in that fragile silence hanging between life and death, fear and trust, something happened that no one expected. One woman stepped out from the trench, unarmed, trembling, eyes wide. And for the first time in this war she chose hope. The woman who stepped forward had a face drawn by exhaustion, but her eyes held something Elias didn't expect: courage fighting through terror. She raised her empty hands, palms trembling, and walked slowly toward him. Every step looked like a negotiation between fear and faith. Her name was Lena Summer, a former medical trainee who had never imagined touching a gun, let alone pointing one at an enemy. The other women watched her move as if she were walking off a cliff. Lena's breath shook in her chest as she whispered the first words across the silent field. Are you going to kill us? Elias understood her German imperfectly, but the meaning hit him like a blow. He shook his head, lowering his arms further. No, he said softly. We're not here to kill you. The words carried across the field like a warm wind through winter. Some of the women sagged with relief, others stood rigid, suspicious, remembering everything they had been told, that American soldiers would torture them, violate them, execute them. Lena looked back at her companions. Seeing that tiny spark of hope flare in their eyes, she turned again toward Elias and took another cautious step closer. From behind Elias, his squad watched in stunned disbelief. One whispered, "This is madness." Another lowered his rifle instinctively, unable to aim at women who looked more like famine victims than soldiers. Elias, still alone in the open, felt every heartbeat like a drum, but he didn't waver. He kept his hands raised, his posture calm, his voice steady. "You don't have to die here," he said in German. "We can end this without hurting anyone." The women exchanged looks, fear battling the possibility of survival. It was the first time in weeks that someone had offered them a choice. Lena turned to the nearest bunker and shouted, "They're not going to shoot." Her voice cracked but carried. A few rifles lowered. Some women sobbed, the tension spilling out as tears. Others clutched their uniforms as if the fabric itself held them together. Their commanding officer was nowhere to be seen. He had abandoned them hours earlier, fleeing before the Americans arrived. They had been left alone to die, yet here stood an enemy soldier asking them to live. Slowly, hesitantly, like snow melting under early spring sun, the defensive line started to crumble. Elias motioned gently with his hand. "Please, put down the weapons." Lena nodded first, turning back to her trench, picking up the rifle she had been forced to carry. and setting it on the ground as if laying down a burden she had never been meant to hold. One by one, others followed. The clatter of rifles hitting dirt echoed across the valley like a strange metallic prayer, each sound a declaration that fear was losing. Elias felt something tighten in his throat. These women were choosing trust in a moment when trust felt impossible. When nearly half the rifles had been lowered, Elias took one step closer, then another. The women flinched at first but didn't retreat. A young girl, she couldn't have been older than 17, burst into tears and cried out, "I don't want to die." Elias's heart split. "You won't," he answered gently. "Not today." The field, moments ago a killing ground, became something else entirely, a fragile bridge between enemies built out of nothing but one man's refusal to fire a gun. Then, with a final wave from Lena, the surrender began. Women stood from their trenches in slow, shaky motions. Some held hands, others supported those too weak to walk alone. Elias turned and signaled to his squad, "Stand down. Do not fire." The Americans lowered their weapons, equally stunned and relieved. What was supposed to be a battle had turned into an impossible moment of grace. As the women approached, their fear gave way to confusion, then to overwhelming emotion. Some thanked Elias in broken English. Others simply stared at him, as if trying to understand how a man raised in war could choose mercy. Lena stepped forward again, close enough now to see the dirt on Elias's uniform and the sincerity in his eyes. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why help us?" Elias inhaled, searching for the right words. "Because you're not soldiers," he said. "You're people." It was simple, it was human, and it shattered something inside every woman listening. By nightfall, all 128 women had surrendered peacefully. Not a single shot fired, not a single casualty. The American officers were stunned. Protocol prepared them for clearing bodies, processing prisoners, writing casualty reports, not accepting the surrender of an entire enemy position without firing a bullet. Elias was questioned, praised, and scolded all at once. But the results spoke louder than any reprimand. He had stopped a battle before it began. The following morning, as the women were transported to a temporary processing center, Lena found Elias again. She held out a small folded handkerchief embroidered with her initials in a tiny fading flower. A quiet token, a symbol of gratitude. "You saved us," she whispered. "All of us. If there was a way, if the world were different, we would all thank you in the only way we know." Elias frowned gently. "What do you mean?" Lena smiled, a tired, tender smile. "If the world allowed it, every one of us would marry you." Elias froze. He didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or look away. But Lena wasn't joking. She was speaking for 128 women whose lives he had returned to them. Behind her, several of them nodded, tears shining in their eyes. In that moment, under the pale German morning sky, Elias understood something he would carry for the rest of his life. Mercy doesn't just save lives, it creates them. When the trucks finally rolled out of the valley, Lena sat wedged between two other women on a wooden bench, wrists resting in her lap, fingers still tingling from the feeling of surrender. Outside, the fields of Rosenfeld slid by, familiar earth turned foreign by barbed wire and uniforms. Inside the truck, no one spoke for a long time. They were too busy realizing they were still breathing. One woman stared at her hands like she didn't recognize them. Another quietly sobbed into her sleeve. Lena only saw one thing in her mind: the American soldier standing alone in that field, hands raised, choosing to risk his life instead of taking theirs. At the temporary holding camp, the women were processed like every other prisoner of war, searched, registered, assigned numbers, handed blankets and thin bowls of soup. But something was different about this group. They moved as a unit, watching out for each other, sharing bread, steadying trembling shoulders. Word spread quickly among them that the young American's name was Elias, that he had argued with his own superiors to spare them. At night, huddled under canvas roofs, they whispered about him the way others whispered about ghosts, not as a legend, but as a reminder that the world hadn't entirely gone mad. Back at his unit, Elias filed his report under the dim glow of a lantern. His hand cramped as he wrote the words, "Enemy position secured with no casualties." It sounded too clean for what had really happened. He added details the paperwork didn't require about the abandoned women, about their lack of training, about how sending artillery would have turned the valley into a mass grave. His commanding officer read the report twice, then looked up at him with a mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. "You took a risk," the man said. "If it had gone wrong, they'd court-martial you." Elias nodded. But it didn't, he replied quietly. They're alive. Weeks passed. The war thundered toward its end. Flags changed, borders blurred, and the world tried to remember what peace was supposed to feel like. Elias expected the memory of Rosenfeld to fade, filed away with other strange days in a long, exhausting campaign. It didn't. It stayed sharp, like a splinter under the skin. Then, one afternoon, a clerk wandered into the mess tent carrying a bundle of envelopes. Ward, he called, mispronouncing Elias's name as always. You've got mail. Elias frowned. His family wrote rarely, yet the stack in the clerk's hands was thick dozens of letters, some marked with careful, foreign handwriting. The first envelope was shaky German script. Inside, on thin camp stationery, Lena had written a letter that smelled faintly of disinfectant and cheap ink. She thanked him clumsily at first, tripping over formal phrases. Then the words loosened. She wrote about how the women had been separated into different huts, how they shared stories at night, how none of them could sleep the first few evenings without jolting awake, expecting gunfire that never came. We keep talking about the field, she wrote. We cannot understand why you did what you did. Our officers told us men like you had no mercy. You proved them wrong, and now we have to learn the world all over again. Other letters followed, some from women he barely remembered seeing, others signed only with initials and camp numbers. They described families found alive in bombed-out towns, sisters reunited, mothers writing from home saying, I thought you were dead. They described hunger, illness, slow recovery, and over all of it, the same refrain, I can write this, because you chose not to fire. One letter, written in painstaking English by a woman named Marta, contained a single, unforgettable line, the children I do not have yet already owe you their lives. Elias read that sentence 3 times, his throat tightening. Not all the letters were gentle. One woman admitted she had hated him when she first saw him. She had been ready to shoot, ready to die, ready to prove her loyalty to a regime that had used her as a pawn. When you walked toward us unarmed, she wrote, I thought you were mocking us. I thought you wanted us to feel small. Only later I understood you were risking more than we were. We had only our lives to lose. You had your honor as a soldier. Elias stared at that line for a long time, wrestling with the idea. He had never thought of it that way. To him, honor had always meant something his father taught on the farm. You protect what you can, even when no one will ever know. Months later, after Germany's formal surrender, a different kind of message arrived. This one came not from the camp, but from an administrative office miles away, bearing the stamp of Allied command. It explained that a group of female prisoners from Rosenfeld had submitted a formal request, an odd, unprecedented petition to bring them together for one day and to invite the American soldier who had spared them. They wanted to thank him in person, properly, not from behind wire and paper. The request had climbed its way through board clerks and skeptical officers until someone high enough up read it and felt their own tired heart stirred. Elias almost refused. He didn't like attention. He didn't feel like a hero. The thought of standing in front of all those women made his stomach knot. But when he showed the letter to an older sergeant, the man smirked. You stepped into their line of fire once, he said. You can stand in front of their gratitude. That's the easier bullet to take. So on a clear summer morning, Elias found himself riding in a jeep toward a field beside a prisoner of war camp, wondering what you were supposed to say to 128 people whose death you had postponed. When he stepped out onto the grass, the sight stopped him cold. Rows of women stood in a loose semicircle, no longer in frontline uniforms, but in simple camp clothing, clean, hair tied back, faces still lined with hardship but carrying something new, color, life, the faint beginning of peace. Some leaned on canes, others held hands. As he approached, a murmur rippled through them like wind through wheat. Then Lena stepped forward from the center, a small smile on her face, eyes bright with unshed tears. You came, she said simply. We weren't sure you would. Elias opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, Lena turned to the others and lifted her voice. We made a promise, she called out, that if we ever stood before him again, we would say it together. The women straightened. Some clasped their hands over their hearts. Others wiped their eyes quickly. Then, in accented English and German woven together, they spoke in one voice that rolled over Elias like a wave. If the world were different, every one of us would choose a man like you. It wasn't a legal vow. It wasn't a proposal. It was something older and deeper, a collective way of saying, you became the measure of what we now believe a good man can be. And standing in that field, surrounded by the lives he had almost never known he'd saved. Elias realized that the war had given him one thing it rarely offered anyone: not medals, not glory. It had given him the chance to prove that a single refusal to pull a trigger could echo far louder than any gunshot ever would. Thomas had returned to Nebraska months earlier, but the war had left impressions on him deeper than shrapnel ever could. His hands still carried the memory of that moment when he lowered his rifle, when his boots pressed into German soil not as a conqueror, but as a bridge. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened next: the letters, the reunion, and the unbearable weight of gratitude from women who had been one trigger pull away from oblivion. When he stepped off the train in Munich in September 1946, he felt like he was stepping into a different world. The station was crowded, loud, restless, yet one sound cut through everything: a chorus of voices, women's voices, calling his name. Thomas froze. Standing behind the barrier were dozens of women, young, middle-aged, some with children clinging to their skirts, some still wearing the scars of a war that had tried to consume them. And there, at the front, was Maria Stein, her face lit up with a softness that war had failed to extinguish, and she stepped forward, her hands trembling, not from fear this time, but from something like joy. Thomas didn't know what to do. These women ran to him, hugging him, taking his hands, cupping his cheeks, thanking him in thick accents, in broken English, in tear-soaked German. They touched him not as a hero, but as a person whose one impossible choice had given their future's shape. There were flashes of memories: Maria trembling in the trench, Helena trying to bandage the cut on her arm, Marta praying under her breath as artillery fire shook the earth. Now they stood laughing, crying, alive, all because one farm boy from Nebraska had chosen mercy over war. Later that evening, after the embraces and the photographs and the overwhelming flood of gratitude, Thomas sat in a hall filled with women he had saved. The American Legion had organized food, music, even flowers. But what filled the room wasn't celebration, it was something closer to reclamation. These women who had once been positioned as disposable shields now stood tall, reclaiming identity from a world that had stripped it. Thomas felt humbled. They were the brave ones. They had survived abandonment, propaganda, starvation, and the crushing certainty of death. He had only offered them a chance. When Thomas took the stage, the room fell silent. The wooden platform creaked beneath his boots, and he gripped the podium not out of fear, but out of reverence. These people deserved words that mattered, and so he told them what he had never said out loud, not to his officers, not to his mother, not even to himself. He told them that he had seen their faces on that April morning, frightened, confused, whispering prayers into trembling hands, and something in him had broken. He hadn't seen enemies. He had seen the injustice of a war that forced innocents into uniforms and fed them into trenches. "I didn't save you," he said quietly. "I just refused to let the world destroy you." The hall erupted in applause, but it wasn't loud. It was steady, warm, grateful, rising like a heartbeat. Women wiped at their eyes, hands clasped tightly, as if holding onto the moment itself. Then Maria stepped forward with a small box. Inside was a medal, not military, not official, not valuable in any economic sense. It was a handmade token carved from wood by the women in the camp, a heart. Simple. UNPOLISHED. Human. They pressed it into Thomas's palm. "For choosing the heart over the gun," Maria whispered. After the speech, Thomas found himself surrounded again, but this time the energy was different. Softer. Women approached one by one, sharing fragments of the lives they had rebuilt. Helena spoke of opening a small clinic in Stuttgart. Marta had begun teaching children who had lost everything. Anna had found her brother alive after believing him dead for years. Each story felt like a chapter Thomas had unknowingly authored. His decision at Waldenbach had not simply saved 128 women, it had saved their futures, their children, the legacies they would carry into generations he would never meet. When the gathering ended, Thomas stepped outside into the cool Munich night. The city was rebuilding, cranes silhouetted against the stars. He breathed in deeply smoke, dust, and the faint scent of food from a late-night cafe. For the first time since the war, he felt something loosen inside him. Peace, maybe, or a version of himself he thought he had lost in the chaos of Europe. Maria joined him. She stood beside him in silence for a long moment. Then she spoke quietly. "War teaches us to see enemies everywhere," she said. "But you saw people. That is why we followed you." Thomas shook his head. "I didn't lead anyone," he said. Maria smiled, maybe not with orders, But with courage, they walked together briefly before parting ways. And as Thomas watched her disappear into the darkened street, he understood that Waldenbach was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. The moment Mercy carved a new path through a world still learning how to heal. He returned to Nebraska weeks later, but he carried Munich with him. Not the buildings or the speeches, but the faces of the women who had survived. Because he had dared to see them, the world would move on. History books would forget. But Thomas knew the truth. Sometimes the quietest decisions echo the loudest across generations. Years passed, and the story of Waldenfeld didn't follow Thomas the way reporters or fame might follow other soldiers. It moved differently, quietly, like a river that disappeared into the soil but still nourished everything it touched. He went back to Nebraska, back to the endless fields, the smell of freshly cut hay, the rhythm of life that didn't care for medals or headlines. People around town knew he had served overseas, but no one knew how, and he never told them. The only clue was a wooden heart hanging in the farmhouse hallway, carved so simply that most assumed it was something his kids made in school. But every now and then, a letter would arrive, thin envelope stamped from Germany, Austria, Belgium, written in careful handwriting by women who owed their lives to a young American private who had refused to pull a trigger. Thomas would read those letters alone. Sometimes they made him smile. Sometimes they made his eyes sting. Sometimes he read them twice, 3 times, until the ink felt like whispers. And after each one, he tucked it into a box he kept under his bed. Not out of secrecy, out of respect. The world around him moved on. The Cold War began. Lines were drawn again, new enemies, new fears, new reasons to distrust anyone with the wrong uniform or the wrong language. But Thomas had seen too much to be fooled by uniforms again. He knew that the world was full of ordinary people trapped in extraordinary circumstances, just trying to survive decisions made by men who would never stand where gunfire was loudest. Decades passed. His children grew up, went to school, left home. His wife, Catherine, asked him only once what really happened during the war. Thomas gave a small smile and said, "I learned that sometimes you win a battle by refusing to fight it." She didn't push him. She understood that some stories don't need telling until they need remembering. Then came 1985. Thomas had just finished repairing a fence on the north side of his property when a letter arrived. The envelope was thick, textured, with a German stamp and handwriting he didn't recognize. Inside was an invitation, formal, respectful, almost ceremonial. A German filmmaker named Klaus Hoffmann was creating a documentary about the final months of the war and wanted Thomas to speak about Waldenfeld. He wasn't interested. He didn't want cameras or questions, or strangers digging through the past. But enclosed with the invitation was something else, a photograph. Dozens of women standing in a meadow, older now, gray-haired, wrinkled, weathered, but smiling, every single one of them holding up a wooden heart, the same kind he kept above his hallway, and on the back of the photo, a single line, "We will gather again. One last time. Please come." Thomas stared at it for a long time. Then he called the filmmaker and said he would be there. When he landed in Germany, he didn't know what to expect, but he certainly didn't expect the crowd. The reunion wasn't small. It wasn't quiet. Hundreds of people had gathered, children, grandchildren, husbands, wives, generations of lives that existed because one man had refused to fire a shot. Some carried portraits of the women who had passed away. Some brought flowers. Some came simply to witness the moment. Maria was there, older now, but with the same fire in her eyes. She embraced Thomas like a brother returning home. Others followed, women he barely recognized at first until they spoke his name. Their voices carried echoes of that April morning. They touched his hands, not to thank him again, but simply to connect, as if reminding themselves that the man who had given them life was real, standing warm in front of them. The filmmaker interviewed them all. Maria told the camera, "War taught us fear, but he taught us courage without violence." Helena said, "He could have ended our story. Instead, he started it." An elderly woman named Elsa, who had been only 19 at Waldenfeld, whispered, "I lived because a boy from Nebraska saw me, really saw me." Then Thomas was invited to speak. He felt nervous, more nervous than in battle. He looked at the sea of faces, at families formed from lives he had unknowingly protected. And suddenly the words came, not rehearsed, not heroic, but honest. "I didn't save anyone," he said softly. "I just refused to let war decide who you were." Silence followed. Then applause. Long, rolling applause that seemed to rise from decades of gratitude. After the event, Thomas sat quietly under a tree. Maria joined him, leaning on a cane now but still radiating that same quiet strength. "Do you know," she said, "that over 600 people alive today can trace their existence back to Waldenfeld?" Thomas blinked. 600? Perhaps more, she said. "You didn't just save 128 women. You saved their children, and their children's children. You saved entire branches of family trees." Thomas lowered his eyes, overwhelmed. He had never thought of it that way. He had never imagined that one act of mercy could ripple outward through so many lifetimes. Maria placed a hand over his. "That is why," she whispered, "we said we would all marry you. Because a man who saves a life saves a future." When Thomas returned to Nebraska, he hung the new photograph on his wall beside the wooden heart. He never needed to tell the story. It was written into the lives of strangers across an ocean. It was woven into generations who would never know his name but lived because of him. And if you asked anyone who had been at Waldenfeld what Thomas Weatherly had done, they wouldn't say he ended a battle. They would say he began a legacy. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is refuse to pull the trigger, then don't let it end here. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and help keep stories of compassion alive in a world that often forgets them. And if you want more true historical stories, powerful, emotional, and almost unbelievable, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Your support helps us bring forgotten moments of humanity back to life. Before you go, tell me in the comments, if you were in Thomas's place, would you have made the same choice? I'll be reading every comment.